The most expensive thing I ever bought was the silence that allowed me to hear my children plan my funeral while I was still serving them Christmas pie. I sat in the high-backed wing chair of my colonial home in Connecticut. My body settled into the velvet like a forgotten relic. Outside, the December wind howled against the glass, but inside, the air was heavy with the cold luxury of silver garlands, white velvet stockings, and the cloying scent of pine-scented candles. My daughter-in-law, Claire, had spent the morning curating the living room for her social media feed, moving my old family photos into a drawer because the frames clashed with the minimalist aesthetic. I didn't protest. I simply sat. I adjusted the silver hair at my temples, making sure the small beige devices tucked behind my ears were completely hidden. And to Julian and Claire, those hearing aids were the white flags of my final surrender. They were the definitive proof that Martha Vance, the woman who had spent 40 years building a regional logistics empire from a single rusty van, was finally, mercifully broken. I kept my gaze fixed on the muted television, my face a mask of hard-working exhaustion and quiet wisdom. Julian and my only son sat on the leather sofa just 6 feet away, swiveling a glass of vintage Bordeaux that I had paid for. He didn't look at me. He looked through me as if I were a smudge on the window that he'd eventually get around to cleaning. "The place in New Jersey is cheap," Julian said, his voice as sharp and clinical as a winter frost. "Because it's called the Evergreens. The brochures talk about community, but the reviews say the staff-to-patient ratio is minimal. It doesn't matter, though. She won't know the difference. We can move her in by February, sell this house, and finally get the liquidity we need for the beachfront property in Maui." Claire leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a materialistic hunger that made her look like a predatory bird. "And the jewelry, Julian? The jadeite bangles she hides in the safe? Your mother has no idea what they're worth in today's market. If we list them through a private broker now, we can cover the down payment on the beach house before she even realizes they're missing from her vanity. She probably thinks they're costume jewelry by now." I felt a choking sorrow rise in my throat, a thick, bitter bile that made every breath feel like I was swallowing jagged glass. I sat there, a 65-year-old woman with Da Trang Lan, that cool, fair skin that now looked translucent and ghostly in the holiday lights, and Da Hon Hop Tien Dao that felt slick with the cold sweat of a profound betrayal. They looked right at me, and they saw nothing. I was a ghost in my own home. The anatomy of betrayal. "Did you see her today?" Claire giggled, a sound that grated against my nerves like sandpaper on silk. She spent 3 hours making that mince pie, and her hands were shaking the whole time. She's becoming an embarrassment, Julian. At the club last week, she actually asked the waiter to repeat the specials twice. I had to apologize to the Whitmores. It's time we put the trash out. Julian nodded, tapping the face of his Rolex, the one I had bought him for his 30th birthday, as a symbol of the time I had sacrificed for him. "She's lived her life, Claire. It's our turn now. She's always been so self-sacrificing, right? She'd probably be happy to know she's finally useful for our bottom line. We'll tell her it's a luxury retreat. She'll believe anything if we say it with a smile. So this is how they repay me?" The thought was a low, slow vibration in my mind, a fragmented echo of 40 years of toil. I looked at my hands resting in my lap. They were gnarled, the knuckles swollen from decades of manual labor before the business took off. To Julian and Claire, these were just sandpaper hands, unsightly, worn, and primitive. They didn't see the history written in the calluses. And they didn't see the nights I spent in the warehouse, the blood I spilled on the concrete floors, or the way I turned my body into a shield to protect Julian from the world's coldness. They only saw the jadeite ring on my finger, a deep, translucent green that represented a fortune they were already spending in their heads. The silence of the prey. I felt the quiet wisdom of my life's experiences beginning to settle over my hurt. I realized that my children had developed delusions of power so absolute that they believed they could dictate the terms of my existence in my own presence. They thought my world had become silent, a quiet hallway leading to a dark room. They didn't know that I had stopped listening to their words long ago. I was listening to their hearts, and their hearts were hollow, echoing with the clink of coins and the rustle of deeds. Julian stood up, stretching his arms with the casual entitlement of a man who has never had to earn his own safety. "I'll call the broker tomorrow, Claire. We'll get the jewelry appraised while she's napping. She's so deaf she won't even hear the safe door click." He walked over to me, his shadow falling across my chair like a shroud. He patted my shoulder with a patronizing heaviness. "Going to bed, Mom? You look exhausted. Don't worry about the dishes. We'll leave them for the morning. You just rest." I looked up at him, my eyes clouded with a manufactured confusion, my voice fragmented and small. "What's that, dear? The dishes?" "Yes, Mom, the dishes," he shouted, his face reddening with the effort of communicating with someone he deemed obsolete. "Go to sleep." I nodded obediently, my heart a shattered shard of ice. "Yes, Julian. Good night, dear." As I climbed the stairs, every step a deliberate act of self-sacrificing performance, I felt the choking sorrow begin to transform. The hurt was still there, a raw ache in my chest. But beneath it, something else was stirring. A cold, clear-headed resolve. They thought I was the invisible ghost of the Christmas season. They didn't realize that a ghost has the power to haunt. And as I reached the top of the stairs, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an architect. The Act 1 of my disposal was over, but the Act 1 of my rise was just beginning. We spend our lives building foundations for our children, believing that the stronger the base, the higher they can soar. But we often forget that if we make the foundation too comfortable, they will never learn to build walls of their own. They will simply look down at the stone that supports them and call it trash. Never mistake a mother's silence for a lack of content. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is listen to the sound of her own erasure so she can decide exactly how to rewrite the ending. The door to my bedroom clicked shut, but it couldn't lock out the sound of their laughter. It drifted up through the floorboards, a light, bubbly sound that felt like acid against my skin. Downstairs, the vulture's banquet was in full swing. I could hear the rhythmic clink of silver against china, the heavy heirloom silver I had polished until my sandpaper hands bled as they feasted on the remains of the life I had built for them. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my 53-kilogram frame feeling heavier than it ever had when I was hauling crates in the warehouse. My da trang lan, this fair, cool-toned skin, Julian once said, made me look like a classic lady, now looked gray and sallow in the vanity mirror. My dahon haute-couture felt slick and tight, the oil of 1,000 anxieties seeping through my pores. I sat in the dark, for every breath a jagged struggle against the choking sorrow that threatened to drown me. So this is how they repay me? To understand why their words felt like a serrated blade, you have to understand the ledger of my life. You have to understand that Julian's delusions of power were paid for in a currency of salt and iron. I closed my eyes, and the low, slow ache of 1991 came rushing back. I remembered the plasma center in Bridgeport. It was a sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory that smelled of ozone and cheap floor wax. I was 30 years old, a widow with a 7-year-old son who cried because he didn't have the same cool sneakers as the boys at his private school. I sat in a plastic chair, my arm outstretched, watching my own blood swirl through a plastic tube. Or I watched the machine separate the yellow plasma, the literal essence of my strength, so I could walk out with $40 in my pocket. $40 for a heating bill, $40 for a graphing calculator, $40 for the aesthetic Julian demanded even then. I remembered the pharmaceutical vats. Before the logistics company took off, I spent 4 years on the graveyard shift at a local lab. I was 155 centimeters of raw, desperate determination. I climbed into the heavy steel tanks to scrub the residue of caustic chemicals. The fumes were so thick they felt like a physical weight in my lungs, making me cough until my ribs felt like they would snap. The chemicals would seep into my gloves, aggravating my dahon haute-couture until my face and neck were a map of red, weeping welts. And I did it so Julian would never know what it felt like to be hungry. I did it so he could walk through the world with the arrogance of a boy who believed he was born for the sun. I turned my body into a shield, taking the burns, the needles, and the exhaustion, all so he could grow up in a cold luxury he never had to earn. And now downstairs the vulture was picking at the bones. "Did you check the safe combination?" I heard Claire's muffled voice, followed by a giggle. "Julian, if we get the Maui house, I want a walk-in closet larger than this entire floor. We can leave her old furniture here. It's so dated. It smells like hard-working misery." Julian's reply was a low, dismissive grunt. "She's lived in this house for 40 years, Claire. She's part of the plumbing now. She doesn't need aesthetic. She needs a room with a nurse who can handle her quiet wisdom without rolling her eyes. I'm tired of hearing about the old days and the struggle. The struggle is over, Mom. We won. Now give us the prize." Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they think that because I grew quiet, I had lost the capacity to count the cost of their betrayal? I sat in the darkness of my room, my heart a fragmented mess. I had been self-sacrificing for so long that I had accidentally taught them that my soul was a commodity. I had made my love so free and so abundant that they valued it at exactly 0. I looked at the jadeite ring on my finger. Thomas had given it to me when our company hit its first million. "For the woman who never gave up," he had whispered. Now, my son wanted to liquidate the asset, to buy a view of the ocean. The vulture's banquet was a celebration of my erasure. They were dividing the jewelry, the house, and the legacy as if I were already in the ground. They talked about the Evergreens nursing home, as if it were a trash bin for a mother who had outlived her usefulness. "She's so deaf she won't even hear the safe door click," Julian had said. A cold, clear-headed resolve began to flicker in the center of my grief. The choking sorrow didn't vanish, but it began to harden into something sharp. I reached for the beige devices tucked behind my ears. I felt the smooth, cold plastic of the most expensive silence I had ever purchased. They thought I was the invisible ghost of their Christmas Eve. They thought my world was a silent, empty hallway. And they didn't realize that I was the one holding the recording. They didn't realize that every cruel word, every materialistic plan, and every disrespectful laugh was being encoded into a cloud server they couldn't touch. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was the archivist of their treachery. The banquet downstairs continued, the wine flowing and the greed growing. But as I sat on my bed, my breathing finally steadying, I realized that the low, slow voice of my life was about to change. I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish. You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that the woman who could survive the vats and the needles is the same woman who knows exactly how to tear down a glass house. I leaned back against the headboard, the silver garlands downstairs mocking the darkness above. The Act 2 of my disposal was nearly finished, but the Act 2 of my reckoning, it was just beginning. We often think that by protecting our children from the world's harshness, we are doing them a kindness. But a bird that never feels the wind will never learn to respect the wings that carry it. I made my life a sacrifice so Julian wouldn't have to suffer. But in doing so, I raised a man who couldn't recognize the value of a soul. True dignity is not found in what we are given, but in what we have the courage to defend. Never let your kindness become a doormat, for eventually the people walking on it will forget that there is a heart beating beneath their feet. The silence of my bedroom was a lie. Even with the door shut and the world downstairs muffled, the air was screaming with the weight of what I had just heard. I sat on the edge of my mattress, my 155-centimeter frame, feeling like it was being crushed by the atmosphere itself. In the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the Connecticut pines, I looked at my hands. They were trembling, not with the tremors of the senile old woman Julian believed me to be, but with the raw, vibrating fury of a creator watching her masterpiece spit in her face. The ledger of blood is not just a poetic phrase I use to comfort myself in the dark. It is the literal accounting of my life. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and the low, slow hum of the past began to thrum in my ears. I was transported back to the winter of 1991, and the memory was so vivid I could almost smell the ozone and the cheap lemon-scented floor wax of the Bridgeport Plasma Center. I was a young widow then, barely 53 kilograms, struggling to hold on to a world that was determined to slip through my fingers. Julian was 7. He had come home crying because his classmates at the private school, a school I insisted he attend so he would never feel less than, had mocked his generic sneakers. I remembered sitting in that high-backed plastic chair, my Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, looking like translucent parchment under the flickering fluorescent lights. I watched the thick needle slide into the crook of my arm, a cold, clinical bite. I watched my own life force, the yellow, straw-colored plasma, spiral through the plastic tubing into a collection bottle. Twice a week for 6 months, And I traded my vitality for $40 a pop. $40 for the sneakers, $40 for the heating oil, $40 for the aesthetic that Julian had craved since he was old enough to point a finger. So this is how they repay me? Did Julian ever wonder why my arms were always covered in long sleeves, even in the humid Connecticut summers? Did he ever ask why I was always so tired, why my breath was always a shallow, fragmented thing? No. He only saw the shoes. He only saw the cold luxury I managed to scrape together for him, never realizing the basement of his life was flooded with his mother's blood. Then came the pharmaceutical vats. To expand the logistics company, I needed capital that no bank would give a woman in the early 90s. So I took the graveyard shift at a chemical lab, and I spent 4 years climbing into the massive, echoing bellies of stainless steel tanks to scrub away the residue of caustic compounds. The fumes were a toxic soup that scorched my lungs. I remembered the way the chemicals reacted with my dahon hop tayandao, combination oily skin, causing painful, weeping rashes that I hid behind thick bandages. I stood in those vats, a tiny woman against a giant machine, scrubbing until my sandpaper hands were raw, and my knuckles began their permanent rhythmic ache. I did it so Julian would never have to know the smell of bleach or the taste of desperation. I turned my body into a machine of hard-working sacrifice, fueled by a quiet wisdom that told me if I suffered enough, he would be safe. I built the logistics empire in the hours between the plasma center and the chemical vats, using the secret strength of a woman who has nothing left to lose but her child's future. And now, downstairs, he sits in a chair I bought, drinking wine I paid for, calling me trash. He and Claire talked about liquidating the asset. They talked about the jadeite bangles Thomas gave me, pieces of jewelry that represented the first year we finally made a profit, the first year I didn't have to sell my plasma to buy a Christmas turkey. To them, those bangles are just materialistic wins, numbers on a broker's spreadsheet. They don't see the ledger of blood etched into every facet of the stones. They don't see the nights I spent coughing up the taste of industrial soap, so those bangles could one day sit on my vanity. Did they really think I had become that senile? And did they truly believe that because I had become self-sacrificing by habit, I had lost the strategic intelligence that allowed me to outmaneuver every logistics rival in the tri-state area? Julian's delusions of power are so absolute that he has mistaken my grace for weakness. He looks at my haggard face and sees an ending. He doesn't realize he's looking at a map of a war I've already won. I felt the choking sorrow begin to transform. The low, slow voice of the grieving mother was hardening into something clear-headed and sharp. I reached out and touched the beige devices tucked behind my ears. They were cool to the touch, a miracle of modern engineering that had cost more than Julian's first car. They thought my world was silent. They thought I was a ghost haunting my own hallways. And they didn't realize that I was the only one in this house who truly heard everything. The ledger of blood is coming due, Julian, and you don't have enough materialistic wealth in the world to pay the interest. I stood up, my back straight, the quiet wisdom of my 65 years settling over me like a suit of armor. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a creditor, and I was about to audit his soul. The greatest error of the ungrateful is the assumption that sacrifice is a silent, bottomless well. They drink until they are full, never realizing that every drop was drawn with a winch made of someone else's bone. We spend our lives protecting our children from the sandpaper reality of the world, only to realize that in doing so, we have raised people who cannot recognize the texture of a soul. Our true dignity is not found in what we give away, but in the strength we keep for the day the world tries to take the rest. Never mistake a long-suffering heart for a conquered one, for the same hands that built the house are the only ones who know which stone will make it fall. The silver garlands draped across the mantel seem to catch the light and turn it into something cold and sharp, mirroring the atmosphere in the room. I watched Julian swirl his wine, the firelight dancing in the deep red liquid. He looked every bit the successful vice president of Vance Logistics, a title he wore like a bespoke suit, never realizing that the fabric of his entire existence was woven from the threads of my exhaustion. By the time Julian had reached 25, the quiet wisdom of my business decisions had transformed our small, desperate operation into a regional powerhouse. I had moved from the warehouse floor to the boardroom, but I never lost the hard-working soul of a woman who knew the value of $1. I gave him a vice presidency he hadn't earned, a corner office with a view of the city, and a salary that allowed him to believe he was a self-made man. I bought him his first home in an affluent zip code and bankrolled the lavish 6-figure wedding to Claire, a woman whose materialistic hunger was only matched by her ability to look at me and see a servant rather than a provider. I had been self-sacrificing for so long that they began to view my labor as a natural resource, as infinite and invisible as the oxygen they breathed. They never once asked if my back ached from the decades of lifting, or if my mind was tired from carrying the weight of their security. They just assumed I was finally becoming that senile, a failing vessel that was no longer capable of holding onto the wealth I had created. Julian stood up then, stretching his arms with a casual entitlement that made my stomach turn. He walked over to the sideboard and helped himself to another slice of the mince pie I'd spent all afternoon perfecting. He didn't even taste it. He just swallowed it down like fuel. "I'll call the broker tomorrow, Claire," he said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "We'll get the jewelry appraised while she's napping. She's so deaf she won't even hear the safe door click. We need to move fast if we want to lock in the Maui property before the spring season." Claire giggled, that high, brittle sound that usually signaled she was about to spend money that wasn't hers. "And the house, Julian? The aesthetic of this place is so dated. We can stage it, get rid of all this heavy mahogany, and have it on the market by March. It'll fund the renovations on the beach house perfectly." I felt a surge of strategic intelligence beneath the choking sorrow. They thought I was a ghost, a fading memory of a woman who used to be powerful. They didn't realize that the architect of their dreams was still very much awake, and she was currently documenting her own demolition. Julian walked over to my chair. He looked down at me, his face full of a patronizing fake empathy. He reached down and patted my shoulder, his hand heavy and dismissive. "Going to bed, Mom? You look exhausted. Your Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, is looking quite pale tonight. You really shouldn't overexert yourself with the baking. Don't worry about the dishes. We'll leave them for the morning. You just go up and rest." I looked up at him, allowing my jaw to slacken slightly, my eyes taking on a glassy, unfocused sheen. I let the Da Hon Hop Tien Dao combination oily skin on my forehead catch the light, making me look older, more fragile, more haggard. "What's that, dear?" I asked, my voice a fragmented whisper. "The dishes? Do I need to do the dishes?" Julian let out a huff of exasperated breath, turning to Claire with a look that said, "See? She's gone." He leaned down toward my ear and shouted, his face reddening with the effort of communicating with what he deemed a broken machine. "No, Mom, the dishes are fine. Go to sleep. Upstairs. Bed." I nodded obediently, clutching my shawl around my shoulders, as if I were shivering from the cold and not the sheer icy clarity of my resolve. "Yes, Julian, upstairs. Good night, dear. Good night, Claire." As I turned to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of them in the mirror above the foyer, two predators celebrating a kill they hadn't even made yet. Once I reached the sanctuary of my bedroom, the low, slow voice in my head finally transformed. It became clear-headed and sharp. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat at my vanity in the moonlight and reached for my smartphone, which was hidden beneath a stack of old journals. The hidden weapon was not a secret bank account or a concealed will. It was sitting right in my ears. 3 months ago, after realizing that the whispers in the hallway were becoming more frequent and more cruel, I hadn't gone to a standard audiologist. I had gone to a boutique tech firm in New York. My hearing aids were custom-built prototypes. They didn't just amplify sound. They were high-fidelity, military-grade recording devices, and they were linked via an encrypted cloud-based signal transmission directly to my phone. Every word Julian and Claire had spoken in the living room, every plan to sell my house, every joke about my sandpaper hands, every detail of the Evergreens nursing home was recorded in crystal-clear audio, time-stamped, and backed up in 3 separate secure locations. I opened the app and hit play. Julian's voice filled the room, stripped of its filial mask. "She won't know the difference. Move her in by February. She's so deaf she won't even hear the safe door click." I felt a cold, firm, and decisive strength settle into my bones. They thought I was a resource to be mined. They didn't realize that the woman who built a logistics empire from nothing still knew exactly how to dismantle a shipment that didn't meet specifications. The architect was done building for them. From this moment on, I was only building for myself. Did they really think I had become that senile? I whispered to the empty room. I leaned back against the headboard, the silver garlands downstairs mocking the darkness. The Act 4 of my life was about to begin, and for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't just listening. I was keeping a record. We spend our lives making things easy for the ones we love, believing that gratitude is the natural result of comfort. But comfort is a dangerous drug. It breeds entitlement and erases the memory of the struggle. When you become the architect of someone else's ease, you inadvertently become the first person they decide they no longer need. Never let your kindness become an expectation, for once people stop seeing the effort, and they stop seeing the person. Today, I realized that my greatest mistake wasn't giving too much. It was giving so much that they forgot I had anything left to take. But as I've learned in business, the one who holds the data holds the power. And I have never been better informed. The staircase of my colonial home had never felt so steep. Each step was a rhythmic, agonizing reminder of the hard-working years I had spent on the warehouse floor, my knees clicking like the very clocks Julian was so eager to sell. I kept my head down, shoulders slumped in a practiced display of defeat, moving with the low, slow gait of a woman who had supposedly lost her grip on the world. Behind me, in the living room, the vultures' banquet continued, their voices muted, but their intent ringing through my skull like a discordant bell. Once inside the sanctuary of my bedroom, I didn't turn on the lights. I leaned against the heavy mahogany door, the same door Julian had once slammed in teenage tantrums, the same door I had polished until my sandpaper hands were raw, and I turned the deadbolt. The click was the first honest sound I'd heard all night. In the darkness, I reached up and touched the small beige devices tucked behind my silver hair. They felt cool and heavy, a masterpiece of strategic intelligence that cost more than Julian's first 3 cars combined. To my children, these were the medical shackles of my old age, the white flags of my sensory surrender. To me, they were my ears, my witnesses, and my ultimate hidden weapon. I sat at my vanity, the moonlight catching the da trang lan, fair, cool-toned skin, of my reflection, my da hon hop tian dao, combination oily skin, felt slick with the residue of a long performative evening. I pulled my smartphone from its hiding place beneath a stack of Thomas's old journals and opened the encrypted app. The interface was clean, clinical, and utterly devoid of the materialistic fluff Claire adored. It was the digital ledger of their betrayal. I hit play. The audio was high fidelity, stripped of the ambient crackle of the fireplace or the clinking of Bordeaux glasses. It was just the raw, unvarnished truth of my son's soul. The place in New Jersey is cheap. The Evergreens, she won't know the difference. Julian's voice filled the room, sounding thinner, more desperate than it did in person. We can move her in by February, sell this house, and finally get the liquidity we need. Then came Claire's giggle, a sound that felt like a serrated blade across my heart. And the jewelry, Julian, the jadeite bangles. Your mother has no idea what they're worth. Hey, we can cover the down payment on the beach house before she even realizes they're missing. I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. So this is how they repay me? I didn't go to a standard audiologist 3 months ago when the whispers started getting louder. I didn't want a standard solution for a family that had become standard in its greed. I had traveled to a boutique tech firm in New York, a place where they didn't see a haggard grandmother. They saw a client with the capital to demand the impossible. These hearing aids were prototypes, equipped with high-sensitivity directional microphones and a cloud-based signal transmission system. Every word spoken within 20 feet of me was being recorded, time-stamped, and uploaded to a secure server. I sat there in the dark, the choking sorrow of the living room beginning to evaporate, replaced by a cold, architectural clarity. Julian and Claire believed my world was getting quieter. They believed the silence was a fog rolling in to swallow my mind. They didn't realize that the silence was actually a gift they had given me by underestimating the woman who built the very walls they were trying to steal. Did they really think I had become that senile? I whispered to my reflection. My voice was no longer the fragmented murmur I used for the dinner table. It was firm and decisive. I had spent my life as the architect of their dreams, turning my blood into their wine and my sweat into their silver garlands. I had been self-sacrificing to a fault, believing that if I provided enough cold luxury, they would never have to feel the sandpaper reality of the world. I was wrong. By protecting them from the struggle, I had raised parasites who mistook my grace for weakness. I scrolled through the recordings. There were dozens of them. Plans to liquidate my stocks. Discussions about which of my old friends to stop inviting so they wouldn't clutter the new aesthetic. Even a conversation about how to fake my signature on a power of attorney document if I refused to be reasonable. I felt a surge of quiet wisdom. For 30 years, I had navigated the logistics of a multi-state empire. I knew how to track a shipment, and I knew how to spot a leak. Julian and Claire weren't just my children. They were a failed delivery, a damaged cargo that needed to be accounted for. And the gift of silence wasn't just the ability to hear their treachery. It was the power of their assumption. As long as they believed I was deaf, they would continue to hang themselves with their own words. They were building a gallows out of their own arrogance, and I was simply the silent witness to the construction. I leaned back against the headboard, the low, slow voice of my grief, finally silenced by the sharp tone of my resolve. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a strategist, and the audit was just beginning. We often think that being heard is the ultimate form of validation. We shout to be recognized. We plead to be understood. But there is a terrifying absolute power in being the only one who truly hears. Silence is not an absence of sound. It is a space where the truth is forced to reveal itself. My son thought he was robbing me of my senses. Instead, he gave me the one thing I needed to survive, an unvarnished look at the hearts I had helped create. Never mistake a quiet room for an empty one. The most dangerous person in the house is the one you've stopped being careful around. My kindness was a choice, but so is my justice. And the recording never lies. For the next 3 weeks, I perfected the art of being a shadow in my own home. I became the invisible ghost of the Christmas season, moving through the hallways of my colonial house with a quietness that Julian and Claire mistook for the frailty of a woman on the verge of the evergreens. I let them believe I was drifting away, a 155-centimeter vessel of hard-working exhaustion that was finally leaking its last bits of life. My da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, seemed to grow paler in the winter light, and I purposely neglected the Da Hon Hop Tien Dao, combination oily, on my T-zone, allowing the haggard shine of stress to sit on my face. It was a mask. I wanted them to see exactly what their greed expected to find. A mother who was no longer a person, but a problem to be solved. The digital witness was always active. Every time I stepped into a room, the beige devices behind my ears became the silent recording clerks of my children's treachery. The anatomy of greed. The first major recording happened on a Tuesday, while the house was heavy with the scent of pine and the cold luxury of Claire's silver ribbons. She had insisted on helping me organize my jewelry box, claiming it would be therapeutic for me to see my treasures. I watched her through the mirror. Her nimble, greedy fingers, unmarred by a single day of the sandpaper labor that had built this house, lingered over the 18-karat gold and the rare jadeite bangles Thomas had given me. She picked up a sapphire brooch, her eyes reflecting the materialistic hunger that had become her primary personality trait. "Julian," she whispered, not realizing that my phone in the drawer was catching every syllable via the cloud-based signal. "Look at this one. The clarity is insane. If we go to the private broker in Manhattan, we can get at least $40,000 just for this piece. We can tell her it fell down the drain while she was washing her hands. She's so confused lately, she'll probably apologize for being clumsy." I sat there, my sandpaper hands folded neatly in my lap, my face a picture of quiet wisdom and manufactured vacancy. "It's a pretty blue, isn't it, Claire?" I murmured, my voice a fragmented whisper. "Yes, Martha, very pretty," she replied, her voice dripping with a disrespectful condescension that made my skin crawl. As soon as I turned my head, I heard the subtle click of her phone camera. She was cataloging the inventory for her auctioneer. The broker's phone call. 2 days later, the hidden weapon captured Julian in the library. He was on the phone with a real estate agent, his voice full of the delusions of power that come with spending money you haven't yet stolen. "Listen," Julian said, his voice sharp and clinical. "We need to move the asset by early spring. The Maui property is contingent on a quick sale of the Connecticut house. I'm the executor of the estate. I'll handle the paperwork. She's not in a position to contest. We're moving her to a facility in New Jersey in February." Silence from the other end. "No, she doesn't know yet," Julian laughed, a sound that felt like a serrated blade in my chest. "She thinks we're going on a luxury retreat. Just get the listing ready. The aesthetic of the place is dated, so emphasize the land value. We need the liquidity, and we need it now." I was standing in the hallway clutching a stack of freshly laundered towels, my heart a heavy, fragmented weight. I felt the choking sorrow try to rise, but I pushed it down with a new cold strategic intelligence. I wasn't just a mother anymore, I was a witness. Every conversation was a brick in the wall I was building around them. I recorded them discussing how to minimize my wardrobe so they could pack me off in a single suitcase. I recorded them laughing about the cheapness of the Jersey nursing home, joking that the smell of industrial bleach would be a nostalgic reminder of my days scrubbing vats. The ledger of the ghost. By the third week, the folder on my phone was an encrypted library of betrayal. I had hours of audio, dozens of photos of Claire taking my jewelry, and in copies of Julian's emails to the broker. The gradual escalation of power within me had reached a boiling point. I had been self-sacrificing for 40 years, believing that my silence was my strength. But the digital witness taught me that silence is only a weapon, if you know when to break it. Julian and Claire were building a gallows out of their own arrogance, and I was simply the architect providing the wood. They thought my world was getting quieter. They didn't realize that in my world, their voices were the only things I could hear. I looked at my reflection one final time before the grand dinner. The haggard face was still there, but the eyes were different. They were firm and decisive. The invisible ghost was done observing. The architect of their dreams was about to become the author of their reckoning. Did they really think I had become that senile? I whispered, the words no longer a question, but a sentence. The most dangerous person in the room is the one who has been taught that they are invisible. We spend our lives protecting those we love, only to find that our protection has become their permission to destroy us. But data, cold, digital, unvarnished data, is a mirror that the arrogant cannot look away from. My son thought he was liquidating an asset. He didn't realize he was liquidating his own soul. Never mistake a mother's patience for a lack of perception. Sometimes the only way to save a family is to let the truth set the house on fire. The contextual vibes of the evening were designed to be a masterpiece of cold luxury. Outside, the Connecticut woods were swallowed by a silent, bone-chilling frost. But inside the Vance Manor, the air was thick with the scent of expensive pine, roasted prime rib, and the cloying sweet smoke of the fireplace. The dining room was a theater of silver and crystal. Every surface reflected the light of the massive chandelier, casting a glittering artificial glow over the 20 guests who had gathered for my annual grand dinner. I sat at the center of the long mahogany table, a petite figure of 155 centimeters and 53 kilograms, looking every bit the fragile relic my children had told everyone I was. My Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, looked almost translucent against the dark velvet of my dress. And then I had left the Da Hon Hop Tien Dao, combination oily, on my forehead untouched by powder, allowing the natural sheen to suggest the haggard exhaustion of a woman failing in health. To the guests, the CEO of the local hospital, several board members of the logistics firms I once commanded, and my own nephews, I was a figure of pity. I caught them stealing glances at me, their eyes full of a soft, patronizing sadness. Julian had spent the cocktail hour seeding the room with quiet wisdom about my decline. He spoke in hushed tones about the evergreens, framing my forced exile as a well-deserved luxury retreat for a mother who could no longer handle the world's noise. Julian sat at the foot of the table, acting like the undisputed master of the house. He swirled his wine with the arrogance of a man who had already spent the inheritance in his mind. Beside him, Claire was a vision of materialistic triumph. She was wearing the new diamond earrings she'd bought with the down payment they had skimmed from my private dividends. They sparkled with a light that felt like an insult. She laughed too loudly, her hand frequently resting on Julian's arm, as they exchanged disrespectful looks of shared victory. So this is how they repay me? The thought was a low, slow vibration in my chest, a rhythmic ache that matched the swelling of my knuckles. I looked around the table at the people I had helped, the careers I had launched, and the charities I had funded. They were all enjoying the cold luxury of my life's work, unaware that the host of the evening was being prepared for disposal like holiday trash. I felt the choking sorrow of the invisible ghost. I was surrounded by people, yet I was utterly alone in the silence they believed I inhabited. Every time a guest tried to speak to me, I leaned in, cupping my hand over my ear, forcing them to repeat themselves until they gave up with a frustrated, pitying smile. I played the part of the senile mother perfectly, a self-sacrificing performance that allowed the vultures to feel safe. But beneath the silver hair and the manufactured confusion, my strategic intelligence was operating at a frequency they couldn't even imagine. The beige devices behind my ears were humming with a clear-headed sharpness. They weren't just amplifying the clinking of the silver. They were archiving the final, a damning evidence of Julian's betrayal. Through the cloud-based signal on my phone, I could hear the whispered side conversations at the end of the table. "He says the house is on the market by March," my nephew whispered to his wife. "Can you believe the liquidity they're going to get?" "I just feel bad for Martha," she replied. "But I guess she really is gone. Look at her. She doesn't even know what day it is." I felt the gradual escalation of power beginning to simmer in my marrow. The low, slow voice of the hurt mother was being eclipsed by the firm, decisive voice of the founder. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a creditor. And the interest on 30 years of blood and chemical vats was about to come due. As the main course was cleared and the grand flaming pudding was brought into the darkened room, the blue brandy fire dancing like a ghost on the silver platter, Julian stood up. He tapped his glass with a spoon, the sharp ping, ping, ping cutting through the laughter. He looked at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a face full of delusions of power. "Friends, family," Julian began, his voice projecting with a false empathy that made my skin crawl. "Before we finish this wonderful evening, I'd like to say a few words about the woman who made all of this possible." I sat back in my chair, my sandpaper hand steady beneath the table. The turning point was seconds away. The hidden weapon was primed. He thought he was about to give a toast to my sunset. He had no idea he was about to witness his own eclipse. "To my mother," Julian said, raising his glass high, his eyes sweeping the room to ensure he had everyone's attention. "The strongest woman I know, though her health is fading and her world is getting a bit quieter. We are honored to take care of her in her golden years. To Mom." The room rose, a sea of white velvet and black wool, their glasses held high in a toast to my erasure. I looked Julian directly in the eye, the manufactured fog in my gaze clearing to reveal a firm, decisive light he hadn't seen in years. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room with a resonance that made the crystal on the table ring. "I have a gift for everyone. Since you're so worried about my world getting quiet, I thought I'd share what I've been listening to lately. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only exists in a crowded room when you realize the people you love are already speaking about you in the past tense. We spend our lives building cold luxury for those who follow us, hoping it will be a shelter for their gratitude. But for the ungrateful, a shelter is just a cage they want to sell for the land value. Never assume that the quietest person at the table is the weakest. Often they are simply the only ones who have bothered to learn the truth. My son thought he was hosting a dinner. He didn't realize he was actually the led witness in his own trial. The echo of the toast still hung in the air, a cloying, suffocating mist of hypocrisy. The 20 guests, men and women who had known me for decades, who had seen me transform from a weary warehouse clerk into the matriarch of Vance Logistics, held their crystal flutes aloft. They looked at Julian with admiration and at me with that unbearable, soft-edged pity. Julian stood at the foot of the table, his chest puffed out with the arrogance of a man who believed he had successfully inherited a kingdom while the queen was still breathing. "To Mom," he repeated, his smile as bright and hollow as a polished bone. I didn't raise my glass. I didn't smile. I sat perfectly still, my Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, looking like carved marble under the glow of the chandelier. And I felt the slickness of my Da Hon Hop Tien Dao combination oily skin, on my brow, not from the heat of the room, but from the cold clinical precision of the moment I had been engineering for 3 weeks. "Julian," I said. My voice wasn't the low, slow, fragmented whisper I had used to play the role of the failing grandmother. It was firm and decisive. It was the voice that had once commanded a fleet of 500 trucks across the eastern seaboard. It cut through the festive chatter like a freight train through a paper wall. The guests froze. Julian's glass stopped halfway to his lips. "Mom," he stammered, his delusions of power flickering for a brief, terrified second. "What are you doing? You can't hear the toast, dear. Sit back. Drink your—" "I heard every word, Julian," I said, my tone sharpening into a blade. I heard the toast you just gave, and I've heard every toast you've given in the dark hallways of this house when you thought my world was silent." I reached for my smartphone, which sat beside my untouched plate of prime rib. Julian's eyes darted to the device. He still didn't understand. He thought I was holding a toy I didn't know how to use. He thought I was becoming that senile. "You've all been told that my world is getting quiet," I said, looking around the table at my friends and colleagues. "Julian and Claire have been very diligent in spreading the news of my decline. They wanted you to be prepared for the day I disappeared into the evergreens. But the truth is, I've never heard more clearly in my life." I tapped the screen. The high-output Bluetooth speakers I had hidden within the elaborate floral centerpiece, hidden behind the silver ribbons and the cold luxury of the pine boughs, came to life with a soft, digital chime. Then Julian's voice filled the dining room. "The place in New Jersey is cheap. She won't know the difference. We can move her in by February, sell this house, and finally get the liquidity we need for the beachfront property in Maui." The room went into a vacuum of shock. I watched Dr. Aris, the CEO of the hospital, set his glass down so hard the stem nearly snapped. The board members of my former company exchanged horrified looks. I tapped the screen again. Now it was Claire's voice, high and giddy with materialistic greed. "And the jewelry, Julian? The jadeite bangles? Your mother has no idea what they're worth. And if we list them through a private broker now, we can cover the down payment before she even realizes they're missing from her vanity." Julian's face went through a fascinating rhythmic transformation. First, it went a sickly, translucent white, then a mottled, ugly purple. He looked at Claire, who was clutching her napkin, as if it were a life raft, her eyes wide with a raw, naked terror. "Mom, that's not what it sounds like," Julian shouted, his voice cracking, his disrespectful mask finally torn away. "That was just a stressful conversation. We were worried about you." "Worried about the liquidity of my safe, Julian?" I asked. I stood up, my 155-centimeter frame suddenly feeling like a monolith. I looked at my sandpaper hands, then at him. "Did you really think I had become that senile? And did you think that the woman who spent 4 years scrubbing caustic chemicals out of pharmaceutical vats so you could have a life of glass and silver wouldn't know how to protect her own empire?" I looked at the guests, then back at my son. The gradual escalation of power had reached its peak. The invisible ghost was gone. "I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish," I said, the signature dialogue ringing through the hall like a sentence from a judge. "You've forgotten who built this empire, and you've forgotten that my kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on." The playback continued, a relentless stream of their private betrayals, their laughter at my shaking hands, and their plans to strip my home of its dated aesthetic. Every word was a nail in the coffin of their reputation. Julian slumped into his chair, the arrogance drained out of him, leaving nothing but a small, frightened boy who had tried to play a game he didn't understand. Claire was sobbing into her silk napkin, but no one moved to comfort her. The unmasking was total. The turning point had arrived, and for the first time in 30 years, the silence in the room belonged entirely to me. The most dangerous error you can make is assuming that a person's physical decline is a decline of their soul. We mistake the dimming of the eyes for the dimming of the mind, and the softening of the ears for the softening of the will. But for those of us who have lived through the vats and the needles, silence is not a void. It is a vantage point. My son thought he was hosting a funeral for a living woman, and he didn't realize he was actually the one being buried under the weight of his own words. Dignity is not given. It is defended. And sometimes the only way to be truly heard is to let the world believe you are deaf. The blue flames of the holiday pudding flickered and died, leaving the dining room in a thick, suffocating twilight. The only light now came from the dying embers in the fireplace and the sharp, clinical glow of the smartphone sitting in the center of the mahogany table. The digital echoes of Julian's voice, planning my erasure with the cold precision of a stock trade, seemed to vibrate in the very crystal of the wine glasses. Julian was no longer the materialistic prince of the Vance legacy. He looked small. He looked fragile. He sat slumped in his chair, his face a mottled, ugly purple that clashed violently with the cold luxury of his surroundings. Beside him, Claire was shivering, her nimble, greedy fingers clutching the edge of the table as if the wood itself might slip away. "Mom," Julian whispered, his voice a disrespectful rasp that attempted a last pathetic grasp at empathy. It was the stress, the company, the logistics markets are shifting. We were talking out loud. We would never have actually sent you to a place like that. We love you. We were trying to protect the aesthetic of your final years." I didn't blink. I stood at the head of the table, my 155-centimeter frame feeling like a monolith of granite. My Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, looked almost luminous in the dim light, and the Da Hon Hop Tien Dao, combination oily sheen on my brow, wasn't from the heat of the oven, but from the cold, calculated fire of my own strategic intelligence. I looked down at my sandpaper hands, the hands that had carried him, and the hands that had scrubbed the vats, and I felt the quiet wisdom of my life crystallize into a weapon. "Protect the aesthetic," I repeated, my voice firm and decisive, slicing through his excuses like a laboratory scalpel. "You speak of aesthetics as if they are a substitute for a soul, Julian. You talk of protecting my final years while you were already measuring the square footage of my grave." I walked toward him, the sound of my heels on the hardwood, the only rhythm in the room. The guests, the board members, the CEO, the neighbors, sat in a paralysis of shock. They were witnessing the turning point of a dynasty. "Did you really think I had become that senile, Julian?" I asked, leaning over him until he had to look me in the eye. "Because did you truly believe that the woman who outmaneuvered the unions in the 90s and survived the caustic fumes of the pharmaceutical vats wouldn't know how to track a betrayal in her own hallway?" Julian tried to stand, but his legs seemed to have lost their delusions of power. He sank back down, his gaze dropping to the table. "I heard everything clearly, Julian," I said, my voice rising in a gradual escalation of power. "I heard the price you put on my jadeite bangles. I heard the laughter you shared about my shaking hands. I heard the dark thoughts in your hearts that you thought were buried in the silence of my old age." I looked around the table at the faces of my peers. My son believes that because my ears required a tool to hear, my mind had lost the ability to understand. He mistook my self-sacrificing patience for passivity. He forgot that a mother who knows how to build a man also knows exactly how to dismantle him. Claire finally found her voice, a high-pitched, materialistic shriek. "Martha, you're being cruel. We've taken care of you. We kept you in this house. You owe us." I turned my gaze on her, and she went silent, as if I had cut the oxygen from the room. "You owe me for the air you breathe in this house, Claire," I said. "You owe me for the diamonds in your ears and the wine in your glass. You've spent 3 years treating me like a ghost, an invisible piece of furniture in a dated aesthetic. But ghosts have a way of reclaiming what belongs to them." I returned to my seat at the head of the table. The choking sorrow of the earlier acts was gone, replaced by the sharp clarity of the victor. I was no longer the invisible ghost. I was the founder. "I may be old, Julian, but I am not foolish," I said, the signature dialogue ringing through the hall like a sentence from a judge. "You've forgotten who built this empire. You've forgotten that every brick of your luxury was laid with the salt of my sweat and the iron of my resolve." Julian looked up, tears of a too-late apology welling in his eyes. "Mom, please. We can fix this. We can talk about this in private. Don't do this here." "The privacy you wanted was the silence of my disposal, Julian," I replied. "The public stage is the only one you seem to respect. So here is your final lesson in the logistics of a soul. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on. It was a choice. And tonight, I am choosing to withdraw it." I picked up my phone and sent a single pre-drafted message to the security team waiting at the perimeter of the property. The clash was over. The legal hammer was about to fall. The audit of the spirit. In business, we talk about the bottom line, the final number that determines the health of a company. In families, we often hide that number behind the cold luxury of silver garlands and holiday toasts. But the bottom line of a life is not your assets. It is your dignity. My son thought he could liquidate my identity because he had never had to build his own. He mistook my silence for a lack of content. If you are currently the one being whispered about in the hallways of your own life, remember this. A person who has built a world knows exactly how to survive the one that is falling apart. Never apologize for the sandpaper on your hands or the lines on your face. They are the receipts of your existence. And when the ungrateful come to audit your life, make sure they realize that the debt they owe you is one they can never, ever repay. Dignity is not a gift, it is a fortress, and tonight I am the only one inside the walls. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 9, its deep mahogany chime sounding like a funeral bell for the delusions of power Julian and Claire had nurtured in the shadows. The dining room remained paralyzed. My son sat with his mouth agape, a single tear of a too-late apology tracking through the expensive bronzer on his cheek. Beside him, Claire looked as though she had been turned to ice, her nimble, greedy fingers still clutching the napkin that had failed to hide her shame. I stood at the head of the table, my 155-centimeter frame feeling like a monolith of granite. My Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, was no longer the mask of a haggard victim. Under the harsh, expensive glow of the chandelier, it looked like polished marble. Even the Da Han Hop Thien Dao, combination oily skin, on my brow, art which I had previously allowed to shine to mimic the sweat of exhaustion, now gave me the appearance of a woman carved from silver. The recorded conversations you've just heard were not for my entertainment, Julian, I said, my voice firm and decisive, slicing through the cloying scent of pine and prime rib. They were for my records, and for the records of the Vance estate. I didn't have to raise my voice. The strategic intelligence that had built a logistics empire from a single rusty van was now fully engaged. I signaled toward the doorway of the dining room. Sarah, my lead counsel, and a woman I had known since she was a junior associate, stepped into the light. She wasn't dressed as a guest. She wore a sharp charcoal gray suit, and in her hands she carried a thick blue folder, the legal hammer I had spent 3 weeks forging in the silence of my bedroom. Julian, Claire, Sarah began, her voice as clinical and cold as a scalpel. As of 8 p.m. tonight, Martha Vance has executed a total revocation of the discretionary powers previously granted to you within the Vance Family Trust. All corporate credit cards, luxury vehicle leases, and personal stipends have been terminated. The liquidity you were so eager to harvest for a Maui beach house no longer exists for you. Claire let out a shriek that was purely materialistic in its agony. You can't do this. We have a life here, our social standing, the Whitmores, the country club. You're humiliating us in front of everyone. You humiliated yourselves, Claire. And the moment you began calculating the resale value of my jadeite bangles while I was sitting across from you, I replied. I looked at my sandpaper hands, then back at her. My social standing was built on 30 years of sweat and chemical vats. Yours was built on my self-sacrificing nature. One of those things is real. The other is currently dissolving. Julian tried to stand, his face a mottled purple. Mom, this is my house too. You can't just kick us out. I'm the vice president of the company. Correction, Julian, I said, the pacing of my speech accelerating, signifying my final victory. You were an employee at will. As the majority shareholder, I accepted your resignation, effective immediately 10 minutes ago. And as for this house, I gestured to Sarah, who pulled a document from the folder. This is the legal truth you ignored, Sarah said, placing the paper on the table in front of Julian. When Martha transferred the title to the trust 3 years ago, she did so under a strict life estate provision with a conduct-based contingency clause. By documenting your intent to commit elder abuse and financial fraud through the unauthorized liquidation of her assets, you have triggered the immediate termination of your residency rights. I leaned over the table, my shadow falling over Julian's plate. Did you really think I had become that senile? I asked, the signature dialogue echoing in the vast, silent room. Did you think the woman who outmaneuvered the logistics unions in the 90s didn't know how to protect her own roof? You wanted to move me to a cheap home in New Jersey, Julian. I've already had your bags packed. They're sitting in the garage. The clash had reached its peak. The guests at the table, the CEO, the board members, were looking at Julian and Claire not with pity, but with the cold, unblinking judgment of the professional world. They were witnesses to a corporate and personal execution. "I am no longer the invisible ghost of your Christmas, Julian," I said, my voice ringing with an absolute finality. "I am the owner. I am the hard-working soul of this family, and I am done being your doormat." Julian slumped back into his chair. His delusions of power completely evaporated. He looked at the wine he was drinking, realizing it was the last taste of cold luxury he would have for a very long time. "Sarah," I said, turning to my lawyer, "you please ensure the security team escorts Julian and Claire to their new reality. They have 1 hour to clear the premises. Anything left behind will be donated to the same charity that will be receiving my jewelry tomorrow." I sat back down in my wingback chair, the quiet wisdom of my 65 years settling over me like a suit of armor. I didn't feel the choking sorrow anymore. I felt the clean, sharp air of a new horizon. The hammer had fallen, and for the first time in 30 years, the only sound I heard in my home was the sound of my own strength. The greatest error of the greedy is the belief that the law is a tool for the powerful rather than a shield for the righteous. They think that because they can speak the language of contracts and liquidity, they own the world. But the law, like a mother's love, has a memory. It remembers who laid the foundation. It remembers who signed the checks with sandpaper hands. When you try to use the law to erase a person, do not be surprised when the law turns around and erases you instead. Dignity is not just a feeling. It is a legal standing. And tonight I am standing taller than I ever have before. The air in the dining room had been sucked out by the weight of the legal hammer. Julian sat like a hollowed-out tree, his arrogance completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly pulp of a man who realized he had lost a kingdom before he even learned how to rule. Claire was no longer sobbing. She was vibrating with a silent, materialistic panic, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if she could somehow outrun the eviction notice. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my 155-centimeter frame, feeling as tall as the vaulted ceilings. My Da Trunglan, fair, cool-toned skin, looked almost regal under the flickering candlelight, and the Da Han Hop Tien Dao, combination oily skin, on my forehead had settled into a sharp, matte clarity. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a judge. I looked at Dr. Aris, the CEO of the local hospital, and a man who had built his career on the very hard-working ethics Julian had discarded. He sat to my right, his face a mask of profound, unblinking shock. He was the pinnacle of the high society Julian had tried to impress, and now he was the primary witness to Julian's disgrace. "Dr. Aris," I said, my voice firm and decisive, vibrating with a resonance that made the crystal flutes hum. "You've been speaking for months about the lack of funding for the new geriatric wing, the one designed for those who have spent their lives building this city, only to find themselves cast aside by their families when their strength fades." Aris cleared his throat, his gaze shifting from the broken Julian to me. "Yes, Martha, it's a project close to my heart, and we want to provide dignity, real dignity, for those who have been forgotten." I reached into the velvet-lined pocket of my dress. My sandpaper hands, still rough from the decades of chemical vats and warehouse crates, didn't tremble as I pulled out the small, ornate box. Inside were the jadeite bangles and the flawless diamond brooch Thomas had given me, the very hidden assets Julian and Claire had been calculating in the dark. I placed the box on the table and slid it toward Dr. Eris. The cold luxury of the stones seemed to catch the light of the dying fire, mocking the greed that had tried to claim them. "This is the down payment for your Maui beach house, Julian," I said, not looking at my son, but watching Claire's face as her last hope of luxury evaporated. "Except it's not going to a beach house, it's going to the hospital, and these pieces are to be auctioned immediately. Every cent is to be used for that wing. I want the name Vance to stand for the protection of the elderly, not the exploitation of them." Claire let out a strangled gasp, her hand reaching out instinctively toward the box before she realized the entire room was watching her. "Martha, those are family heirlooms. You can't just give away our inheritance." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see an antagonist. I saw a cautionary tale of delusions of power. "It was never your inheritance, Claire," I replied, my pacing fast and sharp. "An inheritance is something earned through love and respect. This was a bounty you tried to collect on a life that wasn't finished yet. You wanted to put the trash out. Well, the trash has been collected. But it's not me who's leaving the house." I turned back to Julian. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy and red. "Mom, please, you're leaving us with nothing. After everything I did for the company." "You did nothing for the company that wasn't paid for 10 times over in your salary, Julian," I said. "Did you really think I had become that senile?" I leaned in, my shadow falling over his plate like a final curtain. "I heard everything clearly, Julian. I heard the price you put on my life. I heard the dark thoughts in your hearts that you thought were buried in the silence of my old age." The room was so quiet I could hear the snow ticking against the window pane. I stood upright, adjusting the silver hair at my temples to ensure my hearing aids were visible, the digital witnesses to their treachery. "I may be old, but I am not foolish," I said, the signature dialogue ringing through the hall like a sentence. "You've forgotten who built this empire, and you've forgotten that my kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on." I gestured to the security detail Sarah had brought. "Escort them out. They have their bags in the garage. They don't need the silver or the china where they're going." As Julian and Claire were led away, their footsteps sounding hollow on the mahogany floor, I turned to my guests. My friends, my colleagues, the people who had truly known my quiet wisdom. "I apologize for the disruption," I said, a faint, genuine smile finally touching my lips. "But Christmas is a time for the truth, and the truth is I've never felt more alive." The charitable reckoning was complete, and I'd stripped the vultures of their prey and turned their greed into a gift for those they had mocked. I sat back down in my wingback chair, the self-sacrificing mother finally laid to rest, and the matriarch of the Vance legacy finally, truly, in command. The ultimate rise in dignity is not found in the accumulation of wealth, but in the power to give it away to those who truly deserve it. Greed is a parasite that believes it owns the host, but it forgets that the host is the source of the life force. When you finally realize that your kindness is a resource you control, not a debt you owe, the world changes. Julian thought he was liquidating my assets. He didn't realize he was actually liquidating his own soul. Never be afraid to set your own house on fire if it's the only way to get the vultures to leave. From the ashes, you can finally build something that smells like freedom. The silver garlands are gone. The cloying funeral scent of Julian's cold luxury candles has been replaced by the honest, sharp aroma of damp earth and the first blossoms of a Connecticut spring. I sit on my porch, a small figure of 155 centimeters and 53 kilograms, watching the sun pull itself over the horizon. My Da Trang Lan, fair, cool-toned skin, is warmed by the light, and for the first time in 30 years, the Da Han Hop Tien Dao, combination oily, on my face isn't slick with the cold sweat of anxiety. It is simply the glow of a woman who has reclaimed her own life. The house is quiet, but it is no longer a silent hallway leading to a dark room. It is a sanctuary, the aftermath of greed. Julian and Claire did not go to Maui. The liquidity they craved vanished like mist the moment the legal hammer fell. And without the Vance family trust to shield them, their materialistic house of cards collapsed with a deafening roar. Bankruptcy. Julian's high society creditors were not as self-sacrificing as his mother. When the stipends stopped, the luxury vehicle leases were revoked, and the country club fees went unpaid. His prominent friends disappeared. Social exile. The recording I played at the Christmas Eve feast did more than strip them of their money. It stripped them of their masks. In a town built on reputation, they became pariahs. The final split. Claire, ever the predator, didn't stay to watch the ship sink. She filed for divorce 3 weeks after the eviction, citing irreconcilable differences, though we all knew the difference was the lack of a 7-figure bank account. Julian reached out to me one last time, a month ago. He didn't come to the front door. He sent a letter from a cramped apartment in a part of the city he used to call the Sticks. It was a too-late apology, a pathetic, ink-stained plea for empathy. He wrote about how hard he was working at a mid-level logistics firm, the kind of sandpaper job he once thought he was above. He asked if we could start over, if he could come home for dinner. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence I gave him this time wasn't a sign of deafness. It was a sign of firm and decisive closure. I am no longer the doormat he can use to wipe the mud of his failures on. The living legacy. Yesterday, I stood in the lobby of the new geriatric wing at the hospital. Dr. Eris walked me through the halls. The walls weren't draped in silver ribbons. They were lined with windows that let in the sun, and the jadeite bangles and the diamond brooch had sold for nearly $450,000 at auction. Every penny of that hidden asset was now flowing into the care of people who had been taught, like I was, that their age made them invisible. As I walked through the wing, I saw women with sandpaper hands holding books, and men with haggard faces laughing in the garden. They weren't trash to be put out. They were the foundation. "You did a good thing, Martha," Eris whispered. "I did a necessary thing, Eris," I replied. "Dignity isn't a gift we give to the elderly. It's a debt we owe them." The final lesson, I leaned back in my wingback chair, the wood solid and familiar beneath me. My quiet wisdom has finally brought me to a place of peace. I reflect on the journey from the plasma center and the pharmaceutical vats to this porch. I realized that for 30 years I had been an architect of dreams. but I had been building them for people who didn't know how to value the stone. I had mistaken sacrifice for love and silence for strength. But the ultimate rise in dignity is the moment you realize that your story is not over just because your children have decided to write the ending. I may be old Julian, but I am not foolish, I whispered to the wind. You forgot who built this empire, and you forgot that a mother's kindness is a flame that can either warm a home or burn a lie to the ground. The new horizon is not about the things I own, but the person I have become. I am Martha Vance. I am hardworking. I am wise. And I am finally, beautifully heard. The audit of the soul. In the end, we are all auditors of our own lives. And we look at the ledger and we see the costs. The blood sold, the chemicals scrubbed, the nights spent in the dark. We often think that the bottom line is the gratitude of those we serve. But that is a flawed calculation. The true bottom line of your life is your own dignity. Never allow your self-sacrificing nature to become a suicide pact for your soul. If the people at your table are planning your erasure while they eat your food, have the courage to take the table back. Silence is a weapon only when you are the one who controls the recording. Do not fear the sandpaper on your hands or the haggard lines on your face. They are the receipts of a life that had the courage to exist. Your kindness is a choice, and you have every right to withdraw it when it is met with greed. Stand tall, even at 155 centimeters. Speak firmly, even when your voice shakes, because the only person who can truly grant you a new horizon is the one you see in the mirror. My kindness was never a doormat. It was a bridge. And today I have finally crossed it to reach myself.